The fire took both their homes the same night, but what neither Eli Turner nor Lena Hayes expected was that, by dawn, the only thing either of them had left in the world was each other. It began quietly, the kind of quiet that feels wrong before anyone can explain why. A dry wind slipping through Ashford Valley long after sunset, rattling fences and whispering through brittle grass that hadn't seen rain in months. And Eli noticed it first not because he was looking for trouble, but because trouble had a way of finding men like him. Men holding onto land that was already slipping through their fingers. And as he stepped out onto his porch, boots scraping against old wood, he saw the ridge in the distance flicker, just once, like a match struck in the dark, and then again, brighter this time, stretching wider, moving faster than anything natural should. And his stomach dropped before his mind could catch up because he knew, the way you just know certain things, that this wasn't something that could be put out with a few buckets and stubbornness. This was something that erased, something that didn't care how long a place had stood or how much of a man's life was buried in its soil. And within minutes the glow became a line, and the line became a wall, and the wall became a living, breathing force rolling toward the valley like it had chosen this night and this place on purpose. And Eli didn't waste time pretending he could stop it. But that didn't mean he was ready to leave. Not yet. Not when the barn still stood. Not when the horses were still inside. Not when every instinct in him screamed that walking away meant losing more than wood and land. It meant losing whatever piece of himself was tied to it. So he ran, through dust that was already beginning to taste like ash, toward animals that could sense what he was only beginning to accept, their movements frantic, eyes wide, bodies slamming against wood as the air thickened, and he shouted over the rising roar, voice already hoarse, trying to calm them, trying to make order out of something that had none. But the wind shifted hard and sudden, carrying heat that didn't belong this close yet, and sparks began to fall like warning shots, catching on dry hay, licking up walls faster than hands could move. And somewhere in the chaos he realized the truth he didn't want to face. He couldn't save it. Not the barn, not the land, maybe not even the animals. And that was the moment something inside him cracked, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet breaking of the belief that effort always mattered. And across the valley, Lena Hayes had already made her decision long before flames touched her fence line, because she had learned the hard way that hesitation cost more than loss ever would. And when the wind turned sharp and the night air carried that unmistakable scent of burning timber and distant destruction, she didn't wait for proof. She didn't stand on her porch hoping it would pass. She moved, fast and deliberate, grabbing only what she could carry without thinking twice about what she left behind. Because memories didn't survive fires, and neither did people who clung to them. Too long. And as she threw her bag into the truck and turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life against the growing thunder in the distance, she spared exactly one glance at the house behind her. Not long enough to regret, just long enough to acknowledge. And then she drove, tires tearing through dirt roads that were already filling with others doing the same, headlights cutting through smoke that thickened by the second. And it wasn't until she hit the bend near the lower ridge that she saw him, a lone figure moving against the flow, riding hard toward the fire instead of away from it. And she knew before she got close who it was because there was only one man in the valley stubborn enough to charge toward something like that when everyone else was running. And she swore under her breath, slamming the brakes so hard the truck fishtailed slightly before stopping. Dust and ash swirling around her as she threw the door open and stepped out into heat that felt too close, too immediate. And he barely slowed when he saw her, eyes fixed past her, toward what was already lost even if he wouldn't admit it yet. And she didn't bother with gentle words or careful reasoning because there wasn't time for either. "You need to turn around," she shouted, voice cutting through the wind. But he shook his head, pulling the horse tighter, jaw set with the kind of determination that ignored logic. "My horses," he started, and she cut him off before he could finish because she had seen enough fires to know how this ended. "They're gone," she said, and the words hit harder than anything else could have, because they weren't just about animals. They were about everything he hadn't accepted yet. And for a second, just one, he hesitated, caught between what he knew and what he couldn't let go of. And behind him the ridge erupted brighter, louder, flames, cresting over like a wave breaking loose. And that was the moment the decision was made for him, whether he liked it or not. And Lena didn't wait for agreement. She moved, grabbing the reins, forcing the moment forward. "Get in," she snapped, already turning toward the truck, already knowing that hesitation now would cost more than pride ever should. And he looked back once, just once, at the land that had defined him, at the house that had held every version of his life, at the barn that was already beginning to glow from within. And something in his expression shifted. Not acceptance, not yet, but the beginning of it, the first crack in the refusal to leave. And then he swung down, boots hitting dirt that trembled under the growing force behind them, and climbed into the truck without another word, slamming the door as Lena gunned the engine. The vehicle lurching forward just as the first true wave of fire broke through the valley, swallowing distance in seconds, chasing them down the road as if it had something to prove. And neither of them spoke as they drove, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much, the kind of loss that hadn't settled yet, the kind that would come later, heavier and quieter, when the flames were gone and the reality remained. And in the rearview mirror, Ashford Valley disappeared. Not slowly, not gently, but all at once, consumed by something that didn't care who they had been before that night, leaving behind nothing but ash, smoke, and two people who didn't yet realize that the fire hadn't just taken their homes. It had stripped away everything except the one thing neither of them had planned to rely on: each other. By morning, the fire had burned itself out, but Ashford Valley was gone, reduced to ash, silence, and the kind of emptiness that didn't feel real until you tried to imagine going back and realized there was nothing left to return to. And the evacuation shelter filled quickly with people carrying the same stunned expression, moving like they hadn't quite caught up to what had happened yet. And Eli Turner sat alone on a set of worn wooden steps just outside, leaning forward with his hands hanging loosely between his knees, eyes fixed on the ground as if the answers might be buried somewhere in the dust, the smell of smoke still clinging to him, still refusing to let go. And he hadn't said much since the night before, not because he didn't have anything to say, but because every thought seemed to circle back to the same moment: the barn, the horses, the last look over his shoulder. And Lena Hayes noticed at the moment she stepped outside, arms folded, her gaze scanning the area before, settling on him, because she recognized that kind of silence, the kind that wasn't calm but hollow, and she didn't rush over, giving it a minute before finally walking up and stopping a few feet away. "You should eat," she said, her voice steady, practical, and he shook his head without looking up. "Not hungry," he muttered, and she exhaled softly, already expecting that answer. "That's not really the point," she replied, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet filled with distant voices and movement from inside the shelter, until she added, almost casually, "My place is gone too." And that got his attention, his head lifting slightly as he looked at her. Really looked this time. "You got out early," he said, and she gave a small shrug, her gaze drifting toward the faint line of smoke still marking where the valley used to be. "Early doesn't mean lucky," she said, and something about the way she said it made him pause, because there was no bitterness there, just fact. And he studied her for a second, trying to understand how she could stand so steady. "You don't seem surprised," he said, and she met his eyes then, calm and direct. "I was ready," she replied, and he frowned slightly. "Ready for that?" he asked, and she nodded once. "For losing everything," she said, and the simplicity of it hit him harder than he expected, because he realized then how unprepared he had been, how much of himself he had tied to something that could vanish overnight, and he ran a hand through his hair, letting out a slow breath. "I wasn't," he admitted, and she nodded again, softer this time. "Yeah, I can tell," she said, not unkindly, just honestly, and he let out a dry, humorless laugh, glancing down again. "What now?" he asked after a moment, and she didn't hesitate. "You rebuild," she said, then added, "where you don't." And he looked up, frustration breaking through. "That's it?" he asked, and she shrugged slightly. "That's life," she replied, and he shook his head, the weight of it pressing in harder now. "No land, no house, that's not rebuilding," he said quietly. "That's starting from nothing." And she stepped a little closer, her voice lowering just enough to feel more personal. "Then start," she said, and he let out another breath, somewhere between disbelief and exhaustion. Easy for you to say, he muttered, and for the first time, something shifted in her expression, something heavier. Not really, she said, pausing briefly before adding, I've started over 3 times. And that caught him off guard. You never said, he replied, and she gave a small, knowing look. You never asked, she said, and the words lingered between them, carrying more meaning than either of them addressed, and Eli leaned back slightly, looking out at the shelter, at the people trying to piece together what came next, and for the first time since the fire, the reality shifted. Not just loss, but the question of what came after. You got somewhere to go? He asked, and Lena hesitated for just a second before shaking her head. No, she said simply, and he nodded slowly. Me neither, he admitted, and the weight of that truth felt different when it wasn't his alone, and neither of them spoke after that. But the silence had changed. It wasn't as empty as before, because now it held something else too. Not comfort exactly, not yet, but the beginning of it, the quiet understanding that out of everything the fire had taken, it had left them standing in the same place, with nowhere else to go, and for the first time, Eli didn't feel like he was facing it alone, and Lena, standing beside him, seemed to understand that without needing to say a word, because sometimes starting over didn't begin with a plan, it began with simply not walking away. In the days that followed, nothing truly got easier, but something quietly began to change, not in their situation, but in them, and it showed in small ways. Like how Eli stopped sitting alone, or how Lena no longer kept her distance quite as firmly. And one evening, as the sky finally cleared of smoke, they sat outside in a silence that no longer felt empty, and Eli spoke first, his voice low. I keep thinking I should have done more, he admitted, and Lena shook her head gently. You couldn't. Stop it, she said. But he exhaled, still restless, still feels like I lost everything. And she glanced at him, her tone steady but softer now. Only if you forget what's still here, she replied, and that made him pause, because for the first time, he wasn't looking back. He was looking beside him, at her, and after a moment he said quietly, I don't know who I am without that place, and she gave a small nod. Then you get to decide, she said, and something about that didn't feel as heavy as it should have, and a faint, tired smile crossed his face. We both lost everything the same night, he said, and she nodded. Yeah. And he added, but we're still here. And this time, when she looked at him, there was something unspoken but certain in her expression. Yeah. We are, she said softly, and the silence that followed wasn't about loss anymore. It was about what came next, because somewhere between the fire and the aftermath, they had stopped being 2 people with nothing left, and become 2 people who, somehow, still had each other, and for the first time since the flames took everything, that felt like enough to begin again.